right, I have a fun video today. We have a 2023 WRX, and this is a shop car. There's a big difference when you're tuning and playing with shop cars versus doing stuff with customer cars. Is with a customer car, you are bound to what the customer wants to do. With a shop car, you can do whatever you want. So far on this car, we have an ETS top mount intercooler and an ETS catback exhaust, and that's it. That's 100% of what's done mechanically. There's some cosmetic stuff. We've got some splitters and some carbon fiber fun pieces and some pretty sick NQ wheels. It's literally my favorite wheel in the whole world, the NT03 Plus M. Yeah, APR splitter, some carbon goodies, ETS intercooler, radiator hoses. But as far as the car is concerned, it's what we would still just call a stage one. So I've tuned this on our both OTS stage one map that we build and kind of a custom map. So I've been using this car to develop this OTS map that we're going to be offering for e-tuning support for people. But today we're going to do some fun things with the intake system on the car. So there's a big question that a lot of people have on these intakes, and does it make power? Is it a part that needs to be replaced on the car? And we're going to discuss that, as well as some of the mods that people are doing to the intake, and see what it actually does on the dyno. Not just what the internet says from people's seat of their pants, but the actual dyno results. So here we have a factory airbox for this car. And as you can see, it's nothing special. It looks just like all the other Subaru airboxes over the years. When you open it up, you have a standard Subaru filter, and that just fell apart, so I will show you. But something new to these airboxes is this carbon trap filter. And there's a lot of debate on the internet about whether removing this carbon trap makes more horsepower, or if it's just, if it doesn't, if this is not a restriction, or if it is a restriction. So what we're going to do is we're going to test on the car. Now the one that's currently on the vehicle has the carbon trap. I'm going to take the carbon trap out of this extra one that I have here, and we're going to test the stock filter element, carbon trap, no carbon trap, and then we're also going to test this aftermarket panel filter. This is an AEM dry flow. The part number isn't actually for this car, but one of the things about air filters is if it fits, it ships. So this one does fit, and so we're going to test it. So first we're going to do a baseline on the car right now, this very minute. Do a poll, a couple polls, see where we are horsepower wise, and then we're going to go ahead and just drop this panel filter into the car on the carbon trapped intake and see what it does. And then we're going to mod this box, remove the carbon trap, which is absolutely against, you should not do this unless you are emissions exempt, and we won't be running the car on the street this way. We're just going to test it on the dyno to either confirm or debunk the myth about whether or not this makes horsepower. And then once we do that, we will test both this filter and this filter in the no carbon trap intake. So I have pulled up in the blue is the last time it was on the dyno. It made 292.9 and 367 torque. Today it's making 367 torque and 287.3. So we're missing a little bit of horsepower right in here, and that's probably because I made some changes on the street, but I am making a little more horsepower out the top end. So that's why we don't just compare the last time it was on the dyno to today. What we're going to do is just compare today to today to today. So we don't want to compare apples to oranges, we want to compare apples to apples. So we have a baseline from today on the car, exactly where it's sitting, 287 horse. And like I said, this is just a catback exhaust and that intercooler, which the intercooler at this point isn't doing a lot of work, considering we're still on a totally stock car. We haven't even been able to turn this thing up. And this is just 92 octane pump gas. So we're going to swap the intake filter and do some more pulls and see what happens. Super simple. Like I said, we're just going to take, actually we'll go ahead and pull this this off real quick. Take that off. And as you can see, we still have the carbon filter inside there, which is important. Like I said, it is a mandatory emissions piece. People with aftermarket intakes have to understand that they no longer have that carbon filter, and that is potentially problematic. So we're going to do this AEM filter and see if we pick up any power. Oops, moving the wrong way. Really simple installation. Literally just takes seconds. Takes longer to get these clips back in than it does to install that intake. So we have overlaid in the blue. Now we have our AEM intake filter, and in the red we had the stock intake filter. And you can see the torque number actually lost a couple of foot-pounds of torque, and the reason for that is we hit a little too much boost, and so the boost control system right in there, let's get rid of air fuel. That's not really what we're looking at. So you can see we actually spooled quite a bit faster. And because we spooled quite a bit faster, it overshot a little bit and had to correct, which is fine. If I did a couple more pulls, this would probably smooth out. So I'm not really worried about that little bit of torque loss, but it is interesting to note that we gained some spool up, and we didn't really lose any power. Through the middle, it pretty much follows, but then out here, we picked up power, and out the top, we picked up power. So we're picking up almost 4 horsepower out the top and 4 horsepower in the middle, and faster spool up. So a drop-in filter definitely makes more power on this car. A lot of people say drop-in filters don't pick up horsepower. Here is back-to-back dyno proof that a drop-in filter will pick up more horsepower. That wraps up the panel filter versus stock filter test. The next part of the test is the danger part, the part that we're not supposed to do, the part where we remove this and we test an intake without the carbon trap. And again, I have to say that this is not something that is necessarily right for you. If you live in a place called the United States of America, if you live anywhere in the United States of America, you have to have this in your car. If you remove it, that's on you. I'm not telling anybody to remove this. I'm just saying we're going to test it. So I've never personally taken one of these out, so I don't know what the best removal method is, but we're just going to try a good old X-Acto knife or box cutter or whatever and see if we can not slice our thumb off and instead slice this out. Sure. Oh yeah, if you're doing this, be super careful not to get these in your car. In fact, I'm gonna put gloves back on because we're getting dirty. Well, there you go. It's out. There you go. Once again, I have to state this is purely for academic purposes only, and I in no way, shape, or form recommend or condone this mod. Fun little thing I just wanted to show. These literally are just like a fish tank filter. It's just full of activated charcoal basically, and that is catching PCV vapor that goes back out the intake out into the atmosphere when the engine is off. So that's the purpose of it, is there is PCV crankcase vapor in your intake system, and every time you shut off the car, it's going to exit out the filter. So it's actually a filter for filtering out, not in. So that's the purpose of it, and that's why it's on the car. It's to try to effectively reduce just the vehicle's standing emissions. Not even running, just sitting. Factory. Now, for a modified one, and we're going to go back to the stock air filter for the first test on this one. Ready to do pulls with no carbon trap. Again, this is just for science, purely academic. So here we have the graph of, in the green, the pull we just did, and that's with no carbon trap and a stock intake filter, panel filter. And in the red was the stock carbon trap and stock filter. So this is just the carbon trap difference. And I'm not too worried about the little tiny bit of loss in torque here, as we are 365 now, it was 367 earlier. Again, that's just the boost control system catching up. It overshoots a little bit when we have freer air, which we definitely do, because you can see it spools harder, power comes in sooner. But after about 4,200 RPMs, the green just starts to take off. And now it's not a big gain, it's only about 3 horsepower. Up very, very top, we're actually closer to 10 horsepower. So at 6,000 RPMs, that's 10 horsepower. Now, is that worth taking that carbon trap out? That's up to you, but you know, it is a gain. It is definitely a gain, and it's definitely a gain as you come out to higher RPM. And this is where I feel like the stock intake system just kind of lacks. It definitely can make the torque and flow down low, but up top it just seems to choke out the car a little bit. Next test, we're going to put the panel filter, the AEM drop-in, back into the car with the carbon trap removed and see what our final ultimate stock intake box is. So here we have overlaid our AEM intake with the carbon trap in red and without in blue. And as you can see, just like the stock intake filter with and without, after middle of 4,000 RPMs, the blue just kind of starts to take off until we get out to the top end where we're making about 10 horsepower. Kind of interesting how it just translates regardless of what filter it is. It seems like that carbon filter up top is worth about 10 horsepower. So that's kind of what you have to take into consideration before you consider removing that piece or leaving it stock is, do you drive the car in this area or do you drive the car in this area? If you're racing the car and driving it at high RPMs, you may consider doing an off-road modification like removing that carbon filter. If you street drive the car and drive it in this area, then it's definitely not worth removing. You're not seeing any gains down low. You do see a little bit of spool up, but not really. I mean, you can see we pretty much spooled the same once we had the AEM filter. So yeah, let's just real quick overlay stock. Yeah, so there you go. Stock. Torque was about the same, and again, that's because the boost control system is just doing its work and because the filter is not super restrictive. A little bit more spool up because the turbo can breathe better, and then a little bit more power up top. And again, right here, that's 14 horsepower over stock with the AEM drop-in filter and the carbon filter removed. So that's a decent notable gain up at 6,000 RPMs. But until then, everything below about 43, not really any gains. So that's what we wanted to show with this test, and let you make the decisions whether or not you want to modify that portion of your vehicle or if you want to leave it stock. Personally, if this is a street car, I would 100% leave that stock, as it doesn't affect your part throttle, it doesn't affect your spool up or torque, it just affects top end power. But if you're actually out racing your car, doing quarter-mile pulls or doing track racing autocross, you may consider removing it or doing what we have here and having 2 intake boxes. So I still have the factory box that has it in there, and we can put this in when we're driving the car on the street, and when we're out racing the car, we can take this out. And I know that the tune, because I didn't change anything on the tune between any of these tests, the tune is good for whatever you have in the car when it comes to a factory intake. Now, if you do an aftermarket intake and change the diameter of this, you definitely have to retune the car. But as long as you have this box, the tune's going to take care of the rest. I was about to pull the car off the dyno, and the boss came out and said, "Why don't you do this?" So we have an ETS intake system, Extreme Turbo Systems, that we're going to install. I'm going to have to pull the car off the dyno to do this, but we're going to go ahead and install this intake and retest with the aftermarket intake to show how much more power it makes over doing something silly like cutting out a carbon filter. Fun test. Here we go. Hey, pop the hood. It's a couple hours later. I had another appointment, but then magically not stock. So there it is, the ETS intake. Now I took out the little piece. Let me go grab it. This little piece here is to allow the ETS intake to basically flow closer to a stock MAF calibration, but since we have a calibration for this intake without this, there's no reason to have this in there. This is just a restriction. So I went ahead and flashed my ETS MAF calibration on the car through the access port and fired up, and it fired right up and it's ready to go. Didn't change anything on the boost targets, so we're going to be targeting the same amount of boost and it should be the same ignition timing, although because MAF grams per second does affect engine load, if the load calculation isn't the same, then we will see slightly different ignition, but we're going to compare the ignition timing on the stock intake versus the ignition timing on this one and make sure it's the same to get a proper apples to apples comparison with the ETS intake. So here we go. So like I said, I might have to adjust some of the load tables. First run, we actually picked up power, but we're running almost 2.5 degrees less timing through most of the map because it overstated the load a little bit. And so what we're gonna do is we're gonna correct that and get the timing back. And I think it's gonna be a substantial increase in power. Okay, so here was our best 291.92 and 367.32 foot-pounds of torque. This was the best with the carbon trap removed and the AEM drop-in panel filter. So we just had this ETS intake magically land in the car because ETS is awesome and those guys are super cool and support us all the time. And I just had to, let's just plop it over. So boost target was the same. Spools faster for sure. Hits the exact same amount of boost. We didn't change the boost target at all. I had to pull a little bit of wastegate duty out of the down low because it was trying to overshoot the target. I'll show you that. Whee! So it tried to overshoot and then dipped to try to catch up. So we'll clear that off. Get rid of that one. But you can see once I got the load to calculate correctly, so it's making the same amount of timing everywhere, we just have more power everywhere. Look at this, so look right there. 285 at that spot up to 304. That's almost a 20 horsepower gain off this intake over. You have to remember this is gains over the best we could do on stock airbox. So let's pull back up the original run and compare that. Let's go ahead and close out this, we'll just hide it. Look at that gain there. So stock airbox, everything else is the same on the car. We picked up 21 horsepower at that, or sorry, 25 horsepower right there. Pretty spectacular. So 306 peak today on the ETS intake, 367 torque. Again, the same torque because we're hitting the same boost level and we're not restricted in the intake at that point. But everywhere else you can see we start to pick up tons of power. So better spool up, better power. Intakes are definitely important on this car. The factory airbox is definitely restrictive. The factory intake system with the carbon trap and everything definitely has room to improve. And ETS did a great job building an intake for this car that really opens it up and lets it breathe. So I'm pretty happy with where this car is at the moment. I could definitely run more boost out the top, make a little bit more power. I've ran these, I'm actually only running about 15 pounds up top just because I wanted really consistent intake to intake to intake numbers, and the stock didn't really want to do much more than 15 out the top, so I didn't want to just give it more boost on these subsequent pulls because if I did that it wouldn't be an apples to apples comparison. So this is the same boost targets exactly. Look at that power difference. Now if we raise the boost up top, we'll probably see even more power out the top, but that's for another day. For now, this is where we want to leave it, so pretty good. So we have the parts cannon happening on this car right now. I was just showing my boss the final numbers that we got off this, and he said, hey, I've got this piece in APR Carbon Fiber. So let's install that and see if, since we are breathing through this to get to the airbox, it's the only place that it gets air from, we're gonna see if this makes any difference. Old busted, new hotness. One thing that maybe is promising, this has a divider in it and that one doesn't. Other than that, I don't know that it's any bigger, but we'll see if it makes more power or not. I have my doubts, it might just be cosmetic, but what's fun is when cosmetic parts actually work, so let's find out. Well, no real change. Didn't really expect there to be a change, but you know, sometimes you hope. But hey, it didn't hurt it and it looks good, so we'll take it. It might seem silly to test parts like a carbon scoop, but if you have the car on the dyno and you have the parts on the car, why not test it, right? It just makes sense.